Before we start, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Hold that time in your head. In 1908, time is how long a secret survives between a mailbox and the dead letter office. Washington, D.C., the dead letter office on 14th and K after midnight does not look like a place where cities go bad. It looks like a warehouse with a conscience problem. Long tables, glass lamps, canvas sacks stacked like sandbags. A red line painted on the floor that says, "No clerk may cross with a pocket knife." On the wall, a framed rule that reads, "Deliver if possible." Under that rule, the night shift opens other people's lives and decides what is possible and what is profitable. The floor boss is Mrs. Maud Gall, 50, straight-backed, a widow of a railman who learned to count lies by listening to timetables. She runs the night with two truths. First, the law allows clerks to open undeliverable letters to find a better address. Second, the law does not demand they be stupid about what they find. She keeps a ledger that lists city directories and alias crosses. She keeps a second book that has no title at all. Tonight, a new clerk starts the midnight table. Her name is Eliza Rook, 21, former hotel switchboard girl, fast reader, slower talker. She wears her hair pinned like a school teacher and a blouse with cuffs she stitched herself. She is the wrong kind of curious for this floor. She notices things that do not belong to her, names that repeat, poses that match, the same handwriting on cards that claim to be from 6 different cities. Mrs. Gall sees this in the first hour and decides to promote or bury her by dawn. Eliza's first canvas sack is stamped Chicago Nixie. Undeliverable postcards and letters with bad addresses, smudged ink, and lies. She slits it along the seam the way they were taught. 100 picture postcards slide out and across the table like a deck of cards from a gambler who never loses. Half are ordinary. Children in new coats, cyclers grinning in front of a lake, new buildings named after men who are not dead yet. The other half are not ordinary. Men and women who look as if they were told to stare past the camera and imagine a door opening behind it. Cheeks too bare, shirts too open, a hand placed like a dare. Photographs you could call art if a judge was listening, and something else if a clerk is. By rule, the clerks read the face and the back. The face tells the story people wanted to sell themselves. The back tells you if the story could travel. If the address is bad and the name could be true, you forward. If the address is bad and the name is clever, you must decide whether to save a reputation or sell it. Eliza flips one card and reads the scrawl. Hold for caller, Arcade Station. Tell him Thursday is better than Tuesday. Signed M. There is no city written, no recipient beyond a first initial and a whistle in the ink. It is not deliverable, and it is not innocent. She looks up. Mrs. Gall nods to the metal stamp. Undeliverable. Eliza stamps it and places it in the bin. 2 tables down, a thin man with a waxed mustache named Tobias Vale works like a metronome. 37, postal veteran, bought his comm on a train wreck and never returned it. He is the night's memory. He keeps a card index in his head for addresses that lie by 1 block to avoid a wife. He also keeps a notepad with 2 columns that are not in any manual. On the left, he writes code. On the right, he writes price. When he catches Eliza watching, he leaves the pad in the open and sees whether she pretends not to see it. She does not pretend. He smiles like a confession that went well. A brass clock ticks. 12:30. This is the part of the shift when the floor decides what business it is in. The door in the back wall opens, and a man in a gray suit with a private smile steps through. He is not a postal inspector. He is worse and more necessary. His name is Niles Hart. He used to run a photo studio in Baltimore that specialized in health studies for wealthy men who wanted to feel French in an American way. He learned that people who send themselves pictures are not careful about addresses. A year ago, he started visiting the dead letter office with small donations to the Employee Relief Fund and nicer cigars. He learned where the bins were. He learned that not every clerk believes desire is a sin. He calls what he does the society. He calls what they do corrections. Mrs. Gall does not greet him. That would be corrupt. She allows him to wait by the broken scale in the corner the inspectors cannot afford to fix. She says loudly that the night is heavy, and any citizen who wants to help should donate fresh coffee to the window washers fund. Hart leaves an envelope without counting. She lets him stand there until he looks less like a fox and more like the weather. Eliza's second sack is worse than the first. Postmarks from Galveston, Cincinnati, and a town in Kansas that burned last spring, so its post office is now whatever storekeeper has keys. Most of the cards have no stamps left. People peel stamps when they change their minds. One card keeps its stamp but tries to disguise a name by drowning it in flour. She brushes the flour aside and reads a judge's surname that appears in the newspaper every week, warning families about picture shows. She reads the first line of the message. I will not use the long mirror again. Meet at the Depot Hotel under repairs. The rest of the ink smears as if the sender wiped a thumb and thought better of the second sentence. Eliza does not lift her hand for a boss. She does not announce what she has. She puts the card in the undeliverable tray and moves her eyes to the ledger of city directories. She looks up the judge's home street. She looks up the Depot Hotel address. She makes a note on a scrap the size of a postage stamp that says 2 words, repairs. Widow? Her face does not change because she worked a hotel switchboard and learned in 3 months that anything you show becomes someone else's excuse to use you. Tobias sees the scrap, sees the choice she made, and makes his. He puts down his knife and carries his own tray to Mrs. Gall's desk. In the middle of it, he places 3 cards that bear the same hand and 3 different cities. We have a route, he says. Same studio, same sender, same lie about the station. They will keep coming. Mrs. Gall does not pick up the cards. Is it deliverable? She asks. Not by the post, Tobias says. Then it is educational, she says. We will teach them to write a legible address. This is the floor's joke. The society calls it a plan. It works like this when it works at all. The dead letter office must notify senders when something cannot be delivered if a return address exists. Many of these cards include a return address drawn in pencil and later scratched out with the heel of a hand. The scratch never erases everything. The knight learns to read through shame. The society then writes its own polite notices on paper that looks like a postal form, but is not a postal form. It says, your card was misaddressed. If you wish to ensure future privacy, please confirm the correct station, day, and initials. Return in the enclosed envelope. The enclosed envelope does not return to the government. It returns to a rented box in a city where Niles Hart knows the clerk behind the wicket. Eliza sees the trick in one glance and also sees the trap. If you do this long enough, you stop being a clerk and start being a confession booth that charges. The room gets its first visit from a real inspector at 1. Randall Hume, fastidious, married to a woman who calls the postal uniform handsome and men in plain clothes presumptuous. He examines the relief donations, counts the sacks, and watches the night with the eyes of someone who is waiting for one clerk to use scissors for the wrong cut. He walks the tables and picks up cards at random. Eliza's hands sweat where they touch the table, not because her cards are worse, but because he is the kind of man who finds sin in fear. He stops at Eliza's station and lifts the judge's card. The flower on the name leaves white on his glove. He reads the message once and does not blink. He puts the card back in the tray and says in a voice he uses for church elders and young clerks alike, "I am grateful to the Almighty for modern picture postcards that instruct us in the need for eternal vigilance." He moves on because the tray is stamped undeliverable and nothing is illegal about failure. Niall's heart has seen enough. He leaves without a word, which is the signal. Within the hour, 3 notes will arrive at 3 different counters around the city where Hart keeps mail drops. A tobacconist, a dressmaker, a photographer who pretends to copy school portraits while duplicating postcards for men who need 2 of the same lie. The notes each contain a list of initials and station names clipped from Eliza's and Tobias's trays. They will be used to build a catalog that never exists on paper for more than a night. A catalog that says who, where, and what time. People will not buy bodies. They will buy assurance that their cards will arrive on nights when inspectors sleep. At 2, the room changes from sorting to triage, which is what postal people call deciding who gets saved. A sack marked Dead Letter Office. Returned opens like a library's unkindness. It is full of the society's own polite notices that came back because a man took a risk and then moved, or a woman changed her mind and ripped the corner off the envelope with her teeth, or a boarding house closed and the new landlady stamped, "Not here," with the fury of someone who has rules for other people. Eliza and Tobias must handle their own shadows. Mrs. Gall walks the aisle with her pencil between 2 fingers like a conductor's baton. She stops at Eliza's elbow. "What did you do at the hotel?" she asks quietly. "I listened to people who bought hours," Eliza says, "and I plugged lines when the house wanted to sound clean." "Do you know why we are better than that?" Mrs. Gall asks. "Because we do not pretend to be anything else," Eliza says. Mrs. Gall nods once. "Tonight you will help with notices. If you have a conscience attack, have it after 4. We close the last sack at 3:55. The notices are a system. They use dull language and precise lies. Eliza learns the hand. Your correspondence could not be delivered due to illegible addressing. For future routing to private counters, confirm station and hour. She hates the sentence in the way a surgeon hates a dull scalpel. It works, and it should not. Tobias sets a small pile beside her elbow. 6 cards from 6 cities with 6 backs, written by the same sender. The faces show a woman wearing the same ribbon and the same unconvincing expression against 3 different painted backdrops. A seaside pier, a velvet curtain, a fake Grecian column. The backs are coded like bad spy work. He, they, our room. Eliza flips the cards twice and sees what is wrong. The stamps are postmarked in towns the sender could not possibly have visited in the days shown, not in 1908 and not by rail. The photographer is traveling. The cards are being shot in one studio and mailed by a cousin with a trunk full of postmarks. That means the source is close, not distant. Where? Tobias asks without looking up, as if he already knows she knows. Blodgett Alley, the art room's over the music shop, Eliza says. The pier is down the hall on canvas. The column is a laundry rack. I have seen that curtain. Did you buy it? Tobias asks. I listened to a woman ask whether she looked older, with her hair up, and nobody answered, Eliza says. That is enough? Tobias writes a single line on his pad. Blodgett, column. Price. Schedule not cards. They will stop moving postcards there. They will buy time. They will tell the photographer the society will protect his business by resending undeliverable cards for a fee. He will pay because he has paid worse men for less safety. The dead letter office will call it education again. At 2:30, the floor takes on water. A clerk named Fritz opens a sack labeled St. Louis Fire and finds 66 postcards with scorched corners and messages that read like confessions that tried to burn their own names off. He drops one, the ash kisses his cuff, and the glance from the inspector finds him. Randall Hume returns with his supervisor's voice and asks to see the burned mail. Mrs. Gall gives it to him with both hands, like a midwife holding out a child after a hard night. The inspector reads 3 and decides he has discovered a ring. He has, but not the one he thinks. He calls for a postal detective to ride the morning train to St. Louis. He sets down the stack as if he personally saved someone. He does not look at the corner where Niles Hart's envelope used to sit. He does not notice that the envelope is gone because it is never there when inspectors feel lucky. Eliza does not see the inspector's face. She is busy with a card that should not exist in this bin. It is addressed correctly, stamped correctly, and still ended here. That means someone with a key decided it would. The face shows a man nobody wants to admit they know. A state senator with the smile of a person whose friends say he puts the country first and the bills last. The back does not ask for a meeting. It threatens one. If this is returned, the gallery receives 3. If delivered, we lose the key together. It is initialed with a letter that could belong to anybody or nobody. Eliza looks at the postmark and sees a station box used by the Committee for Organized Temperance. The card is a bomb, soft-wrapped. She does not stand up. She calls Tobias's name without moving her mouth. He is there in a step. He reads the face. He reads the back. He breathes once and sets the card not in a tray, but in his breast pocket under his apron, in the way men do when they would rather be shot than question their own hands in the morning. "What do you call that?" Eliza asks. "A reason to close early," he says. Mrs. Gall rings the brass bell that means 2 things at once: sort faster and make fewer mistakes. The room obeys. Tobias and Eliza do not move any faster. They are already deciding something you cannot put in a manual. Who owns the right to be exposed? Who pays to delay a ruin? Who gets saved because a clerk did not want to hear a woman cry at the counter? At 3:20, Niles Hart returns with his hat in his hand and a face he uses for funerals. He stands at the broken scale and says to Mrs. Gall, "The society will be short this week if the inspectors follow the fire." She says without looking up, "Then you will be creative with your morals," and stamps 3 cards undeliverable that could have been forwarded if she were naive. Eliza writes one more notice. This one she signs with the tiny hand a woman uses when she does not want to be asked to do it again. For privacy routing, confirm station and hour. No further attempts will be made. Tobias sees the script and knows he chose correctly. She is not a saint. She is a clerk who will not sleep if she sends the senator's card either direction. Outside, the milk dray rattles past the window. Inside, the inspector checks his pocket watch and decides he has seen enough to be proud and not enough to be blamed. The brass clock hits 3:55. Mrs. Gall closes the last sack with cord and a knot that will outlive every man in the room. She blows out the last lamp the old way. She leaves the room smelling of oil and paper and another night of other people's mistakes. The first light of morning shows the red line on the floor again. No clerk crossed it with a knife. Every clerk crossed it with a decision. The studio on Blodgett Alley did not sell photographs. It sold excuses printed on paper. It called itself the Athenaeum Art Rooms. The sign in the window showed a Grecian urn, which was brave for a second-floor walk-up that smelled like glue and hot dust. Inside, you could buy a respectable portrait under a velvet drape, or you could buy something that had to travel by postcard because letters felt too confessional. The man behind the camera was Mr. Sutter. He was a respectable liar. He had a wife who said she did bookkeeping and never saw the ledgers. He had a cousin at the arcade station who worked the wicket and knew how to hand mail back through the slot when a face looked like it wanted to leave the city. Niles Hart did not own Sutter. He didn't have to. He owned the route. It started with a card nobody could deliver and ended with a catalog nobody could prove existed. Between those 2 points was the machine. A photographer who supplied faces, a boarding house that supplied names, a station clerk who stamped the lie, and a desk at the dead letter office that turned failure into future business. On a Wednesday, Hart knocked on Sutter's back door with a hat in his hand and the street already mapped in his head. The music shop below covered noise. The alley carried secrets up and trash down. He held 2 things Sutter valued in the same amount: a promise that postcards would keep moving and a threat that the police could be taught to read curtains as crimes. Sutter opened the door with the look of a man who had learned you cannot pretend to be surprised twice. Hart set a small stack of undeliverable cards on the table. The faces on top were Sutter's, same ribbon, same curtain, same smile that pretended not to be practiced. The backs were the problem. Bad station names, penciled initials that smeared. One address scrawled in a child's hand because a child had been asked to write for her aunt, and children write the truth too clearly. "You take the pictures," Hart said. "The mail eats them. I offer a path." "What is the price?" Sutter asked, because men who pretend to have options always ask price first. "We rent weather," Hart said. "When a card misses, my people write instructions that correct the wind. If your clients wish to guarantee a Thursday or a station, they will return the slip with clarity. I charge them to be precise." "And if I say no?" Sutter asked. Hart slid one more card across the table. Not a face, a back. It carried a stamp from the Committee for Organized Temperance. It carried a hand that promised to mail 3 copies to a gallery if this one came back to sender. It was the senator's card, or one like it, depending on which fire put out which shame. Hart did not need the name. Sutter did. He read the scrawl once and looked older. "What do you call this?" Sutter asked softly. "A proof that bad weather blows both ways," Hart said. "We can sell umbrellas, or we can drown." Sutter folded and did not think he was folding. He told his cousin to keep an eye out for envelopes with the society's neat false forms. He told the boarding house to start renting post boxes to out-of-town visitors who did not want a building with a bell to know they existed. He told his wife they were going to sell larger portraits and needed more velvet. The boarding house on Pratt Street had a different problem. Mrs. Lacey ran it like a classroom where nothing got learned. She hated noise and liked money. Hart came with 2 promises for her, too. First, that men who used her address would not bring detectives to her door. Second, that if any inspector did come, Mrs. Lacey would be paid to perform a scene in which she cried for the morals of the Republic and produced a list of lodgers that said Reverend, Widow, Seamstress on repeat. She agreed before he finished the second sentence. She also asked for a rate sheet. Hart had one folded in his pocket like a prayer. "Box only, 1 week, cash," he said, "forwarding to a counter, extra. Retrieval by named friend, more. Rush this week because inspectors love church nights. Premium." He did not mention what happened if a client failed to pay. The machine did not need threats. It had gravity. People who sent cards could not afford to complain about their route in public. The station clerk at the arcade was the hinge. He had a name and a badge and a life that could be inspected. Hart never asked him to do anything illegal. He asked him to be generous with interpretation. When a notice came back confirming an initial and a day, the clerk would make sure the box behind the wicket was clean at that hour. If a client needed assurance that the card would not be seen by the wrong eyes, the clerk would pull it and hand it over the counter with a frown that said, "Please be more careful." The clerk got a gift at Christmas and a favor when his brother's tobacco bill came due. The dead letter office did not approve any of this. It simply made it possible. Eliza and Tobias did not share their trays with Hart. They shared their arithmetic. Codes that meant this sender writes from hotels under clock names. Notes that meant this studio fakes seaside backdrops with a painted rail. The society did not need to know the pictures. It needed to know the roots. The face is the risk. The path is the product. Eliza learned the rest of the machine at a counter 3 miles away where nobody asked whether she had a right to ask questions. The counter was a dressmaker's front room by day and a mail drop after dark. The dressmaker was a man named Miss Fay when he wanted to be polite, and Mr. Fay when he did not have to be. He took in hymns and let men pretend they were supporting the arts when they paid for his time. He also held small stacks of postcards with names on the back that did not match the faces on the front. Eliza watched him once from a bench across the street after her shift. He did 3 things right and 1 thing wrong. Right, never took a card out of sight of a counter. Right, used a paper knife to slide edges and keep oils off the pictures. Right, returned any card that smelled like trouble to the drop box without reading the back. Wrong, pinned a single photograph to a curtain behind his head where customers could see the quality of his work. The photograph was not indecent. It was a portrait of a woman looking left, wearing a ribbon that looked like a decision. But the ribbon and the look matched the cards from Sutter's upstairs studio. Eliza had seen the same pretend thoughtfulness on Blodgett. If a postal inspector with brains walked in, he would smell the route just from that ribbon. She went inside and bought nothing. She asked for a button to be moved. Miss Fay gave her a price that said he liked her face and did not like her eyes. She thanked him, stepped back, and said in a voice that would carry just enough, "I work nights at a place that reads flour off men's names." He understood. The photograph came down before she reached the door. Tobias mapped the other half of the system by looking at cancellations instead of faces. The cards from Galveston smelled wrong because the dates were wrong. He found the cousin with the trunk of postmarks 2 counties over, running a legitimate side business, stamping mail for country stores that could not buy their own. The cousin did not know he was laundering alibis. He was selling a service. You bring a bag of postcards, I sell you stamps, cancel them, and take them to the main office. He charged by the hour and tasted none of the stories. Tobias paid for a ledger line instead of a conscience. He wrote, "Trunk post, fair rates, does not read." Then he wrote, "Vulnerable to sermons." If an inspector came preaching, The cousin would flip and tell a story that made himself the hero. The society would lose a hinge. The machine did not just carry photographs. It built appetites and made arguments. A pastor in Norfolk used it to warn a woman that he would leave his church if she did not leave her boarding house. A cashier in Pittsburgh used it to arrange a meeting for repairs with a man whose wife ran a benefit for orphans. A factory owner in Buffalo used it to send himself a picture of a woman who was not his and write on the back, "This is the face I use to sign checks." The clerks could see the pattern whether they wanted to or not. The society saw it and made a price list. When the first blind auction happened, it was not about a body. It was about a schedule. Two men wanted the same hour at the same station box where a clerk could only look the other way once. Hart had the notices. Mrs. Lacey had the keys. Miss Fay had the counter. The society sold the hour to the highest donor to the Employee Relief Fund, and in exchange both men received a polite notice explaining that routing failures sometimes occurred due to weather. The loser believed the lie because his card still reached somebody at a different hour. The winner believed the lie because it is easier to believe weather than envy. Eliza hated the auction. She hated that people who wrote on postcards like they were talking to mirrors were now buying minutes like they were picking out funerals. Tobias told her it was better than clubs with windows where names echoed. Mrs. Gall told her that in a city like this, the only thing honest about desire is the bill. Eliza took the senator's threat card out of her memory and put the auction next to it and realized both ran on the same rule: leverage before confession. The machine was not a secret to everyone with a badge. Inspector Hume had a junior named Ellis who could listen without losing the sentence in his own opinion. Ellis stood by the arcade wicket for an hour on a Thursday and watched men collect nothing and walk away, relieved. He watched the clerk hand a card to a woman without looking at the face. He watched a boy return an envelope he had clearly opened and resealed with water. He wrote in his notebook that a private routing scheme is being dressed in the skin of government. He brought the note to Hume. Hume did not put it in a file. He put it in his pocket because he was not sure yet whether the scheme kept men out of court or put the post office in one. On a night no different from any other, the machine almost broke itself. Sutter's cousin canceled a stack of cards with the wrong die and the wrong year. The cards looked like ghosts from next winter. The station clerk had a fever and handed 2 notices to the wrong men. Miss Fay forgot to take down a ribbon for the second time, and a woman noticed what she had not been paid to notice. Mrs. Lacey's lodger used the house telephone to ask for the list, not understanding how many walls in a boarding house have ears. Hart felt the tremor before the crash because the dead letter office started sending back notices with the tiniest differences. A comma where none was needed, a date written out instead of in numbers. Confirm changed to kindly confirm. Someone on the floor was telling him to slow down without admitting they were doing it. He brought coffee and said nothing. Mrs. Gall watched him not talk and counted nights. Tobias proposed a patch that was ugly and worked. He suggested printing a second set of false forms that looked like reminders about post rates, and putting the true instruction on the inside flap, where only a person who had learned to be careful would notice. He said it would cut business by 1/3 and trouble by 1/2. Hart knew he was right. Eliza knew it too, and also knew that Hart would compensate by raising the price on the people who could still read carefully. That is how machines behave when they survive. They pass their repairs to the smallest hands. The worst test came from a man who was not on any list, did not pose for any camera, and did not need the society to move his mail. He moved other people. His name was Captain Bellamy, and he worked for a committee that called itself Clean Streets. He liked raids. He liked photographs of shelves of seized liquor and stacks of confiscated postcards because they made him feel like a policeman without having to arrest anybody who could write a check. He shouted his plans at dinners. He told a cousin to tell a cousin to tell a clerk he would be visiting the dead letter office to inspect undeliverables of an obscene nature. The cousin told a cousin who told a clerk who told Miss Fay while buying a button. Miss Fay told Hart. Hart told nobody at the office because he didn't have to. He switched the machine's belts. For 3 days, all notices told people to route through a telegraph counter on M Street, where the operator was deaf in one ear and had a crush on Miss Fay in a tie. For 3 days, Sutter did no seaside sets and only sold velvet drape portraits with shoulders covered. For 3 days, the boarding house sold boxes to school teachers who did not want their families to know they were writing for extra work. For 3 days, the dead letter office sorted undeliverables that read like hymns, and Captain Bellamy arrived, believing he would discover Rome falling apart, and discovered postcards about dog shows and county fairs. He wrote a report anyway. The newspaper printed his photograph. The city had its scandal, and the machine had its map back by Monday. Eliza did not celebrate. She had learned too fast that avoiding a raid was not the same as being right. She took a stack of return notices home and read them until her eyes felt like pennies. She circled 3 names that repeated and 2 that hid inside initials you could not forget after you'd heard them shouted in a Senate hallway. She made a decision that was not on the night's list. She took the senator's card from Tobias's breast pocket while he was lighting a lamp and copied the station and the day. She did not take the card. She put it back. She wrote 1 note of her own on DLO paper that was real. It said, "Your correspondence was misaddressed. There will be no second attempt." She addressed it to the committee's box herself. She did not enclose a false form. She did not include a root. She signed it with the official stamp and her own initials, so that if anyone wanted to be angry, they would have to be angry at a clerk with a salary and a window to stand behind. It was not brave. It was not safe. It was the opposite of the machine. It was a stop. Niles Hart never saw that letter. Mrs. Gall did. She held it to the light, put it into the outgoing sack, and said to Eliza without looking up, "If you do that twice, you will work days at a dead counter in a station with no trains." Eliza nodded. Once was enough. The machine would run. That was the problem. The society never sold bodies. It sold leverage in envelopes. They called it a market because nobody wanted to say auction out loud. It happened on Thursdays when inspectors took their dinners late. The room was a back parlor above a tobacco shop 3 blocks from the dead letter office. No sign. A cracked mirror. A desk with a bell and a rate card folded in half for decency. Niles Hart stood behind the desk with a pencil and never wrote names. Only initials, stations, days, and the word cleared when a counter clerk agreed to look away for 10 minutes. Eliza Rook did not belong there. She went because Mrs. Gall wanted eyes she trusted in a room she did not. Tobias Vale went because he knew the price of time. He had a number for every risk. $3 to move a pickup from noon to dusk, $5 for a different counter in the same station, $7. If a man wanted a clerk to act surprised when a woman handed over the wrong envelope as a signal, he said prices out loud the way doctors say dosages. Calm, bored, exact. The buyers were the city at its worst and most predictable. a judge's clerk with a diction problem and a wallet full of other people's cash, a traveling salesman who had married twice by accident and once on purpose, a deacon who called himself brother to the room and wrote his own name on hotel registers, an heiress with a hat pinned like a threat who wanted to collect her own mail without a chauffeur. They came in groups of 2, never 3. They never said the word picture. They said message. They said privacy. They said weather as if God owed them a forecast. Hart rang the bell and announced the lot like a station master without trains. Box A12, Arcade Station, Thursday 9:15. Counter clerk willing to disregard handwriting for a familiar face. Box M7, Telegraph Hall, Saturday 10 a.m. Operator will slide under stack if asked for Mr. Pendleton. Box R3, Dressmakers, any hour Miss Fay is present and will claim a rush order. There were no seats. You stood, raised your hand, named a number, and tried not to sweat in front of people who might know your shoes. The winning bid was never called a bid. It was entered as a donation to the Employee Relief Fund tin that sat by the bell. The tin had saved 2 postal men with broken legs and 1 clerk with a baby. It also paid for a clerk to forget a stamp once a week. That was how the city slept. The scandal that brought the market its best night started with a woman who could not accept that a postcard was a worse promise than a ring. She used initials that belonged to nobody and an address that belonged to a church that hated her. The card would have died in the sack if not for the back. "Bring the long mirror," it said. "We will see ourselves as they see us." Tobias read the line and marked it with a dot that meant outside help. He handed the dot to Hart. Hart decided to sell the hour around it. A pastor sent his deacon to buy protection from his own sermon. The deacon tried to look bored. The heiress tried to look like she had never seen a deacon. The salesman tried to look at both without being a witness. The judge's clerk bid twice and looked relieved when he lost. Hart took their money and gave them slips with no names, only instructions printed in the kind of type a government uses. Present yourself at the counter calmly. Ask for repair envelope. If denied, state you were instructed to retrieve misaddressed postal. Do not argue. The clerk will nod. Eliza stood by the cracked mirror and watched Hart move the city like paper on a sorting table. He did not lie about the hour. He did not lie about the counter. He lied about why this all needed to exist. He said it kept people safe from raids. It did that sometimes. It also made the raids bigger when they came, because a thing with no price becomes loot. The capture that gave the room its name was not theirs. It was a newspaper man's. He hid behind a pillar at Arcade Station, waiting to watch a scandal look guilty. He did not know that Miss Fay had resent half the cards to the telegraph counter on M Street for 2 days. He watched 3 men collect nothing and leave and wrote a column in his head about how public buildings tempt private ruin. Then he saw the heiress in the hat walk straight to the wicket, say a number, and receive a brown envelope as if she were picking up a parcel of ribbons. He smiled because he thought he had a villain. He was wrong. The heiress opened the envelope in sight of everyone and pulled out a receipt for a donation to the Employee Relief Fund and a note that said, in Tobias's hand, "You will no longer be using this counter." She stared at the receipt, then at the clerk, then at the crowd. She did not cry. She folded the paper and left. The reporter had no picture and less story. He printed a different scandal on Monday. The market sold 2 more hours Tuesday anyway. Eliza understood the trap the society was setting for itself. It had made itself a referee. Referees get blamed when games go wrong. She told Mrs. Gall the room would get raided within a month, not for obscenity, but for pretending to be the post office. Mrs. Gall did not argue. She told Eliza to make sure the tin had a slip showing that a third of the donations had bought coal and a third had paid hospital bills. She told Tobias to prepare a speech about safety. She told Hart to stop bringing cigars. A few days later, the staged exposure proved Eliza right and wrong. It happened at a hotel near the depot in a second-floor sitting room with wallpaper dark enough to forgive everything. The plan was simple and mean. Hart would protect 3 clients by sacrificing one spectacle. He arranged for a punctual scandal to happen in the open while the real dangers took their envelopes 2 streets away. The spectacle was a salesman whose wife had a cousin in the Temperance League and a need to be right. He bragged too loudly that he could collect his mail from the government at dusk without anyone stopping him. Hart let him. He told Miss Fay to hold the envelope until the man arrived with a swagger. He told a freckled boy who ran errands for the paper to stand by the lobby palm with his hands in his pockets. Eliza was sent to the hotel as the postal witness, a pretend clerk who would say the right words if the wrong questions were asked. She had a badge that said temporary office, which meant nothing and everything. She carried a real notice that said misaddressed and a fake one that said repaired. She hated both. The salesman arrived, asked for repairs, and received a brown envelope because Miss Fay had a good memory and a bad patience for men like him. He opened the envelope in the lobby and pulled out not a photograph, but an empty sleeve with a slip inside that read, "Your correspondence was intercepted by error. The Dead Letter Office regrets. For routing advice, attend Thursday." The freckled boy did his part. He ran to a pay telephone and told a city desk that a man had been seen opening a picture envelope in a public lobby. The paper sent a man who could write fast and believe faster. A crowd came. Captain Bellamy came with his Clean Streets pin. The salesman sputtered and pointed at Eliza's badge and shouted that the government had trapped him. Eliza said the sentence she had practiced. The government does not trap customers. The government teaches them to write a legible address. The lobby laughed at the wrong thing. The paper printed postal sting anyway. The next day, 3 men collected their real envelopes on M Street, while Captain Bellamy held up a brown sleeve at a press conference like a fisherman with a story. It should have ended there. It did not, because the judge's clerk changed sides without telling anyone. He had lost an hour at the market and did not like the math. He brought Inspector Hume a list of boxes and counters written in Tobias's exact hand, because Tobias had been careless once and left a scrap in the wrong tray. Hume did not raid the parlor above the tobacco shop. He raided the Dead Letter Office with a warrant printed on paper the size of anger. He came at night. He brought Ellis, the junior who listened, and Captain Bellamy, who shouted, and a photographer who liked pictures of paper more than paper liked pictures of him. He asked to see the undeliverables tray. He asked to see the notices. He asked to see the Employee Relief Fund tin. Mrs. Gall lined it all up on the table in a row, like a mother showing a schoolteacher that her child owned pencils. He asked who wrote the false forms. She said no one wrote false forms. The office printed guidance for correcting bad addresses and private counters were a city matter. He asked to see the stamp Eliza had used on the senator's letter. She showed him the real stamp. He asked too many specific questions for a man who had only visited twice. Tobias understood. He had been betrayed by a clerk who knew the difference between handwriting and voice. He did not glance at Eliza because glancing is a confession. Hume asked for the ledgers. Mrs. Gall gave him the real books, full of directory crosses and routing codes that made the office look like a saint for rescuing mail from bad addresses. He asked for the second book. She said there was no second book. He said he would bring men to look. She said he could bring the army and still not find a book that did not exist. He turned to Eliza and asked if anyone had written to a government committee telling a man there would be no second attempt. She said yes. She said she had sent one stop notice on her authority as a clerk. He asked to whom. She said a committee with a long name and a short memory. He asked why. She said because the dead letter office had a human in it that wanted to sleep. Hume did not arrest anyone. He did not shut down anything. He wrote a report that used the word irregular 5 times and the word obscene once. He recommended that all correspondence to private counters be routed through a new desk where a man with a stiff collar would read every notice before it left the room. He recommended that Eliza be moved to daytime to reduce opportunities for confusion. He recommended nothing about men who bought hours with church money. Captain Bellamy printed his own report and passed it around at dinners. The market kept running because markets run when men are embarrassed. Hart moved the room to a new address and made buyers knock twice. Tobias raised prices by $1 and called it inspection insurance. Miss Fay stopped holding envelopes in sight of lobby palms. Mrs. Lacey made her lodgers sign a new book that said seamstress for everybody and widow for most. The station clerk moved to a different counter and learned to frown more. The society did not shrink. It became careful. Eliza tried to quit. Mrs. Gall told her she could leave the room, but not the work. Every post office is a dead letter office if you live there long enough. She stayed. She sorted. She saved who she could by making their mistakes boring. She kept a duplicate of the senator's card in her head and replaced the picture with a date. Thursday is better than Tuesday. She made sure Thursdays were always crowded with inspections. The dirtiest sale the society ever made was not at the parlor. It was at a church picnic disguised as a fundraiser. A pastor offered to donate the use of the church hall for the Employee Relief Fund auction if the society would agree to sell family hours on Saturday mornings so respectable people could collect their mail without scandal. Hart said yes, because saying no in a church makes noise you cannot buy down later. The hall filled with men who could afford to convince themselves they were good. The tin filled with coins that bought coal for clerks. The society sold an hour to a woman whose husband ran for office. She used it to collect a postcard from a studio that painted Grecian columns over a laundry rack. Tobias stood by the pie table and watched money turn into forgiveness. Eliza stood by the door and watched forgiveness turn into leverage. Mrs. Gall sat at a card table and took notes for a speech about postal safety. Hart shook hands and promised nothing except the thing the city paid for most, a schedule that made sin look like a mix-up and mercy look like a stamp. The marketplace did not die. It learned to whisper. The dead letter office did not confess. It kept receipts. The people who bought hours learned the only truth worth the price. If you want privacy, you cannot mail it to yourself. The raid was scheduled the way people schedule weddings. Too many invitations, the wrong guests, and an assumption nothing important would catch fire. It started with a mistake nobody in the society made. A neighborhood carrier misthrew a bundle on a Saturday. A 12-year-old boy opened a postcard that was not a dog show and not a county fair. It was one of Sutter's, lazy with ribbon and careless with a backdrop. His mother screamed like a siren. Captain Bellamy got his headline before he had his facts. By Monday, he had a meeting in a room with green blinds and men who liked the sound of their own authority. Inspector Hume did not like Bellamy. He liked order. He wrote a memo that said, with government calm, that an interdepartmental inspection would examine undeliverables and private routing abuses on Thursday at 9 p.m. He signed it. He sent Ellis to walk the counters and listen. Ellis came back with 4 addresses and no adjectives. Hume added Miss Fay's shop and Mrs. Lacey's boarding house to the list because his conscience told him they were hinges. Bellamy added the Athenaeum art rooms because his nose told him it smelled like a scandal. Niles Hart had his own meeting, a back room above the tobacco shop. Tin moved to the floor, rate card folded away. He said 8 words that sounded like a prayer and a threat. We will give them the show they want. He meant a controlled burn. He meant pulling the teeth out of their warrant by handing them a mouthful of paper that bit nobody important. Mrs. Gall did not attend Hart's meeting. She ran her own. Dead letter office, night shift only. She told the clerks to bring every notice template to her desk. She told Tobias to empty the employee relief tin into 2 envelopes, one stuffed with small bills and coal receipts, one with nothing but rolled nickels. She told Eliza to make duplicates of the official stamp on a pad of blotting paper and then hide the real die under the floorboard by the broken scale. If they insist on seeing a stamp, she said, we will show them ink, not authority. Eliza walked home through hot air and church bells and decided to be a person again for one night. She wrote 2 actual stop notices on actual government forms, one to the committee box, one to the judge's clerk who had turned state's evidence and was now buying hours under a cousin's name. She put them in a sack marked out of district so they would leave the city before Hume's raid got to her counter. She slept 4 hours and dreamed of buckets. Thursday, 9 p.m., came with a thunderhead that never rained. Hume arrived with Ellis, 3 postal men in stiff collars, and Bellamy in a new suit that squeaked. A photographer followed them like a small dog hoping for scraps. Mrs. Gall stood behind her desk with the ledger of directories open to a page that looked like virtue. She could hear Hart's show beginning elsewhere, the boarding house, the studio, the dressmaker. She could also hear the real danger, curiosity with a badge. Undeliverables, Hume said. Sorted by city, stamped by hand, open for inspection, Mrs. Gall said. She meant the words. She did not mean the part where the stamp they would see was a blotter pressed against ink with a clerk's wrist. Bellamy moved like a man who wanted to break furniture and be thanked for it. He pounced on a tray marked Chicago Nixie, as if Chicago owed him personally. He plucked 24 postcards and fanned them the way a courtroom lawyer fans a witness's shame. Obscene, he announced. Mrs. Gall did not blink. Illegible, she corrected. The law allows us to open for address correction. The law expects us to have eyes. Hume picked up a notice form. He read it twice. The language was boring and perfect. He asked to see the stamp. Eliza handed him a sheet with faint duplicates that would pass in a photograph. He pressed his thumb to one. Ink, not metal. He let it go because he was not going to arrest a blotter in front of a camera. Ellis walked the tables. He saw 2 clerks sweat and 1 clerk work like a clock. He saw Eliza's hand drift toward a tray and stop. He followed her eyes. She was looking at a card in Tobias's breast pocket that was not in any tray. He did not ask for it. He had learned on Tuesday that asking for everything made men stupid. Across town the show played out. At Mrs. Lacey's the lodger book sat open on a lace runner, neat as a sermon. Every entry read, "Widow or seamstress." Bellamy demanded keys. Mrs. Lacey produced them and her tears. They opened box after box to find church flyers and job notices and a stack of perfectly legal cookery receipts. Hart had scrubbed the house 2 hours earlier. He had even sent a woman through to ask aloud whether a postal inspector would like to inspect the widow's pantry. Men who like to be clean prefer kitchens to closets. They left the book and the keys and a promise to return with a man who understood widows better. Mrs. Lacey locked the door after them and laughed into her sleeve until her shoulders hurt. At the Athenaeum art rooms, Mr. Sutter showed velvet drapes, respectable portraits, and a shutter that stuck because the humidity had decided to be unkind. Hume checked a shelf and found a stack of plates wrapped in paper. He unwrapped one and froze. It was not a nude. It was worse for a man in his position. It was a schedule. A glass plate negative showing columns of initials, stations, and days scratched backward in the emulsion like a map meant to be printed and burned. Hart had put it there for a reason. If the raid needed a villain, the plate would volunteer. If the raid needed a souvenir, the plate would obligingly look like one. Hume looked at the plate, looked at Sutter, looked at Bellamy, and did the arithmetic. If he seized it, the city would get names, initials at least, and he would own a scandal he could not control. If he left it, Bellamy would accuse him of softness. He told Ellis to photograph the plate as evidence of routing irregularities. Then he put it back on the shelf and told Sutter to fix his shutter. Ellis took the picture and kept his opinion. At Miss Fay's, the photographer did not get his spectacle. The counter held nothing but bobbins, chalk, and a jar full of straight pins. Miss Fay wore a sober waistcoat and called Bellamy Captain in a tone you use for boys who hurt frogs. She produced a ledger of alterations with names that were true, if you believed in aliases like Mrs. Miller. Hume saw a ribbon on a nail behind the counter and reached for it like a man touching an idea. Miss Fay reached faster. She took it down and smiled in a way that could absolve or ruin. "Decoration," she said. Hume believed her because she told the truth as a weapon. Hart's final amusement was at the arcade station. The clerk behind the wicket obeyed the new rules and frowned like a thunderstorm. Bellamy demanded to see Box A12. The clerk opened it and took out 3 envelopes. 2 were circulars from a temple fair. One was a government notice printed in Eliza's real hand that said there would be no second attempts to route private correspondence to private counters. Bellamy waved it like a flag and shouted about tyranny. Hume read it and thought about sleep. Ellis looked at the stamp angle and knew it was the one true thing in a night full of staged truth. Back at the dead letter office, Hume made his play. He asked for the employee relief tin. Mrs. Gall set it down. He poured the rolled nickels onto the desk with a flourish meant for newspapers. "Funds," he said, "collected illegally by persons pretending to be an arm of the government." Mrs. Gall did not blink. She put the second envelope beside the nickels and opened it. Small bills, coal receipts, hospital bills stamped paid, a note from a widow with a child's handwriting that read, "Thank you for heat." "Funds," she said, "collected legally by employees to assist other employees." The postmaster approved the practice in 1899 after the influenza. Hume knew the memo. He had signed the renewed approval himself. Bellamy did not care. He called it a slush. The photographer took a picture of nickels because paper does not sparkle. The part nobody scripted began at 10:20 when the Carriers' Union decided to be alive. Word had reached them that Bellamy wanted to see sacks at the city depots and put his hands in them. Carriers do not like strange hands in their bags any more than surgeons like strangers in their operating rooms. They called a sick night, not a strike, the law was unkind about strikes, but a sudden inability to run routes until the weather improved. Half the city's bags sat under lock in stations. The raid lost its fuel supply. Hume stared at a wall and did math. If he pushed the carriers, he would have a headline he could not file. If he backed off, he would have a raid that did not stick. He backed off. Bellamy tried to salvage theater. He ordered the photographer to shoot the dead letter office from the doorway. The man set up, focused on rows of trays and faces in lamplight, and waited for someone to look guilty. No one obliged. Tobias trimmed a stamp. Eliza sorted a stack. Mrs. Gall did a thing nobody expected. She opened a stove door. It was a small iron stove used for tea in winter. It ate paper slowly. Mrs. Gall fed it 3 items while Hume watched. A stack of blank false forms printed on cheap stock that looked like government and was not, a bundle of misprinted blotters, and a list of station hours copied from a public circular the raid could have collected at any counter. It looked like a confession. It was a denial. "We burn mistakes," she said. "We don't file them." Hume said nothing because he knew better than to shout over a stove. Bellamy almost put his hand in the door to rescue a piece of paper he could call evidence. Mrs. Gall closed the door with quiet hands and saved him a scar he would have bragged about at dinner. The warrant ran out of breath at 11. Hume signed the log. Ellis wrote, "Irregularities observed. Corrective guidance recommended." Bellamy told the photographer to give him all the plates. The photographer gave him 1 and took 2 to a bar where men paid cash for curiosities. The raid had been big enough to look brave and careful enough to avoid work. That was how cities survived in years like this. The split began that night. Hart learned on the walk home that Hume had photographed the glass schedule. He returned to Sutter's and took the plate. He slid it into a velvet sleeve and walked it to the river, where men toss things when they want to feel like gods. He raised his arm. He did not throw. He realized a plate was not his problem. A map could be rebuilt in a week. A witness could not. He walked back to Blodgett and put the plate in Sutter's hand. "You are going to Missouri," he said. "You will open as Sutter and Son even if you do not have a son. You will send nothing by postcard for a year. You will sell velvet and eyes and not a single ribbon." Miss Fay told him she was moving to Baltimore with or without his blessing. "Cities survive by replacing hardware," she said, straightening her tie. "I prefer towns where the policemen know their own mirrors." She packed a ledger with the names she wanted to keep and burned the rest in a bucket that left a ring on her parlor floor that never came out. Mrs. Lacey rented her top floor to respectable ladies who were in fact the same women with better hats. She stopped selling boxes and started selling pet names for lodgers so that any inspector who came would find the same widow twice and leave confused. Tobias turned in his knife, which for a postal man is the same as turning in your oath. He wrote a resignation addressed to nobody, and a letter to Eliza addressed to the part of her that believed you could change a machine by changing 1 screw. "We are not the arm of any man's sin," he wrote. "We are the cart that keeps the street from stinking. When the cart breaks, the street teaches itself the smell." Eliza took a daytime window in a station where trains never stopped on time. She watched faces make decisions and envelopes learn to lie without help. She kept 3 rules on a slip in her drawer. Don't route revenge. Don't sell a second chance to a first-time fool. Don't let a committee tell you a blotter is a badge. When the senator's assistant appeared one afternoon and asked whether private routing would continue, she said the sentence she had earned the right to say. There will be no second attempts. Hume filed his report. It contained no names. It contained recommendations for stiff collars and oversight and a second stamp desk. He got a commendation for protecting the mail and a reprimand for allowing irregular employee practices to continue. He put both papers in the same drawer and visited Ellis's desk with 2 cups of coffee. "You cannot arrest weather," he said. Ellis nodded. He had started to understand why men invented storms on paper. Bellamy printed his own victory in the newspaper, a grainy photo of a tray, a caption about obscene traffic thwarted, a paragraph praising a raid that seized nothing. He kept the brown sleeve from the hotel lobby on his office wall like a hunter keeps antlers. He ran for alderman and lost by a small margin to a man who promised cleaner streets with fewer speeches. The Carriers' Union called off the sick night and delivered the mail like they always did, with hands that knew which bundles should never have been bundled. They told each other to keep an eye on boys who liked ribbon and men who liked schedules. They delivered one letter to the committee box from a clerk who had written in a small, precise hand that nothing else would be attempted. No one at the committee answered. A secretary filed it in a drawer labeled MISC and forgot to lock it. The society did not die. It changed jurisdictions. It became 3 smaller mistakes instead of 1 large one. In St. Louis, a studio learned to sell only what the city wanted to see. In Baltimore, a dressmaker learned to keep pins in a jar and names in her head. In Cincinnati, a boarding house learned to cry on cue and write widow until the word meant the same thing as renter. In Washington, the dead letter office learned how to hold a stove door shut while a camera watched. The last card Eliza touched that mattered to her had nothing on its face a mother could not display. A woman in a plain dress, looking right, ribbon absent, hair pinned like a decision she would keep this time. On the back, 6 words and a station. Thursday is better than Tuesday. Arcade. She stamped it undeliverable and pushed it into a tray without looking at Tobias's old chair. She rang for the next sack. She opened it. She read flour off a name. She put the knife down when the clock said to. She went home when the sky told the truth. In the morning, men read in the paper that the post office had thwarted an obscenity ring and that the city was safe. The studio on Blodgett went dark. The dressmaker's ribbon disappeared. The boarding house sold fewer boxes and more tea. A boy delivered letters. A captain shined his badge. An inspector sharpened a pencil. A clerk signed a stop notice with her real initials and did not regret it.